This is a sad and tragic story of Indigenous boarding schools and their haunting and painful past in North America and the state of Utah. Recently, I've been watching 1923 starring Harrison Ford. The show piqued my interest to learn more about the dark history of Indigenous boarding schools. 1923 does a great job of showing how brutal, violent, and evil the schools were. It doesn't sugarcoat the treatment of young Native girls at their boarding school, and it can be very hard to watch at times. The boarding schools and the Natives' hardships and mistreatment should not be forgotten history. In 2022, a government report from the Department of Interior acknowledges the United States took thousands of Native American children from their parents, sometimes at gunpoint, from 1819 to 1969 with the intent to strip them of their culture and ultimately take their tribal lands. Indigenous boarding schools were established in the late 1800s and early 1900s to assimilate Indigenous students to be American. Children as young as 6 years old were shipped off to schools, had their hair cut against their will, and were subject to abuse. Many of these Indigenous kids died on the grounds of the schools they attended. The report found that school leaders regularly forbid them from participating or practicing any part of their culture and required students to complete military drills. The schools focused on manual labor and trade skills training, not education. Living conditions were often grossly inadequate. Boarding schools broke up Native families and eroded the health and wealth of tribal citizens and the economics of tribal nations for generations. Investigators found instances when federal officials spent money that was supposed to compensate tribal nations for land to run the boarding schools. The schools also contributed to the erosion of Indigenous languages because students were often punished for speaking their native languages. One boarding school in Kansas, which operates today as Haskell Indian Nations University, purposely housed children from 31 different tribes together in the late 1800s to disrupt tribal relations and discourage or prevent Indian language use.